Mexico is quietly overtaking America's power. The moment America realized it wasn't in control anymore. The sound that marked the shift wasn't an explosion, it was silence. Inside a steel plant outside Detroit, the machines had stopped humming. Conveyor belts sat motionless under flickering lights. Workers stood around, waiting for parts that never came. Across the border in Monterrey, though, the air vibrated with motion. Assembly lines buzzed. Forklifts darted like bees between stacks of half-finished car frames. The contrast was so sharp you could almost hear it through the television broadcast. Even if no one said it out loud, industry had moved south. Here's the twist most people missed. Everyone's eyes were locked on Beijing. News anchors obsessed over tariffs, sanctions, and trade wars in the Pacific. But while America argued about China, its supply chains quietly withdrew themselves just a few hundred miles below Texas. In 2023, U.S. Customs data captured something extraordinary for the first time in modern trade history. Mexico had overtaken China as America's #1 trading partner. Not by a fraction, not by accident, by design, and almost nobody noticed. The headlines never came because this wasn't one dramatic collapse. It was thousands of boring business decisions accumulating into something profound. Every one of those decisions said the same thing: America would rather depend on Mexico than risk another supply disruption from across the ocean. The pandemic shattered the illusion of control. Shipping containers stuck off Los Angeles, semiconductors stranded in Asian ports. Suddenly, proximity wasn't just convenient, it was survival. Nearshoring wasn't a policy, it was an instinct. To understand how we got here, you have to sit with that first moment of quiet in Detroit. That silence wasn't just a production hiccup, it was a symbol. For the first time since the mid-20th century, America didn't own the core of its own industrial momentum. The hum had migrated. Trucks full of parts now crossed the Rio Grande instead of the Pacific. And those parts didn't just feed American factories, they sustained them. The map of power had started rotating south. Get this, Mexico didn't make any grand announcement. No Make Mexico the World's Factory campaign. No new economic doctrine. The transformation unfolded like groundwater seeping under a door. American automakers began moving final assembly to Baja California. Electronics giants quietly expanded in Ciudad Juarez. Data centers and warehouse parks sprang up along highways that used to lead nowhere. When analysts finally tallied the numbers, they realized Mexico had become indispensable to America's survival economy. And yet it didn't look like a takeover. It looked like cooperation, at least at first. The factories were American-owned, the blueprints American-drawn, the financing American-approved. But the labor, infrastructure, and logistical control lay squarely on Mexican soil. That's where the story bends. Because when you hand over your production lines, you hand over a piece of your leverage. Every company that relocated south to cut costs was unknowingly building the economy that could one day compete with them for control of North America. Take 2023. While American broadcasters analyzed inflation charts, freight routes were shifting overnight. 10,000 trucks a day rumbled through Laredo, each one a thread in a new economic web. Inside those containers, microchips from Guadalajara, auto components from León, and solar inverters built in Tijuana. Mexico wasn't just exporting goods, it was exporting reliability. That was the real currency. Reliability after a decade of chaos. Why did this happen under everyone's nose? Because it didn't fit the narrative of a rivalry. There was no conflict, no us versus them, only contracts quietly rewritten. A new industrial map emerged that still bore American logos, but the heartbeat belonged to Mexico. Engineers in Monterrey designed chips for Silicon Valley. Aerospace parts built in Querétaro flew to assembly plants in Kansas. Even the coffee machines in Manhattan offices traced their wiring back to factories in Reynosa. It turned into a North American ecosystem, except now Mexico was the lungs. America just breathed what flowed north. By the time Washington realized it needed to secure its own manufacturing base, Mexico had already become it. Politicians called for re-industrialization, but their supply chains were still drawn through Mexican ports. When tariffs hit China, Mexico's exports to the U.S. spiked again, almost as if the system anticipated the change. Quiet evolution had outmaneuvered grand strategy. Meanwhile, Mexico's cities thrived under this invisible momentum. Monterrey's skyline filled with cranes. Guadalajara's tech parks began calling themselves the Silicon Valley of Latin America. In Tijuana, entire districts converted from maquiladoras to smart factories using automation and AI. They weren't merely chasing American contracts anymore. They were learning, iterating, adapting faster than the corporations who'd arrived to outsource. And that's where concern turns into irony. American companies thought they were de-risking global supply chains by moving closer to home. In reality, they were transferring dependency from Asia to their own neighbor. The supply chain thread now ran north-south, not east-west. Once the new routes were built, redundancy vanished. Everything autos, electronics, medical devices, even solar panels passed through Mexican hubs. If one stopped, half the U.S. economy would stutter. And unlike Beijing, Mexico didn't need to flex power to have influence. Its geography did the heavy lifting. The climax came quietly, Department of Commerce spreadsheets not breaking news. Charts showing how trade with Mexico hit record highs while shipments from China plunged. America hadn't been outmaneuvered in a boardroom or a battlefield, but in the slow math of shipping times and wage differentials. 4 days trucking versus 4 weeks on a container ship, $4.90 an hour versus $30. Those numbers rewrote power dynamics in silence. So when American steel plants stopped and Mexican lines kept running, it wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny grinding forward one procurement order at a time. Everyone had been so focused on China's rise that they missed the continent's own reshaping. A reshaping that didn't come from conflict or conquest, but from the passive momentum of interdependence. And now, it's locked in. That's the mystery we're about to unravel. How America spent decades building a system that would one day make its own dominance optional. Because behind every humming factory floor in Mexico lies an uncomfortable question. If your prosperity depends on your neighbor's efficiency, who really holds the power? To answer that, we need to rewind. Back to the chaos after the pandemic, when the first hints of desperation sent corporate planners searching for safety. Somewhere between broken ports and political standoffs, America drew its contingency plan, and Mexico turned that contingency into opportunity. This is the story of how a country quietly became the new heart of North American industry, and how the United States might have built its own successor without realizing it. The hidden beginning of the nearshoring boom. It started as damage control. In 2021, American companies were still staggering from the supply chain collapse. Cargo ships stacked up at West Coast ports, factories ran out of chips, and the phrase lead time turned toxic in every boardroom. Companies that once bragged about global scale suddenly wanted closeness. Executives didn't use the word nearshoring yet, they said resilience, redundancy, regionalization. All fancy ways to say, we need to stop being one storm away from disaster. Freight costs from Asia had quadrupled. Products that used to take 30 days to ship now took 90. Every container delay meant a production shutdown somewhere in America. That's when planners began circling one country on the map, Mexico. It sat right there inside existing trade frameworks with bilingual engineers, open land, and trucking routes so short they felt like lifelines. None of these moves made headlines at first. They were whispered decisions, contracts tweaked, suppliers swapped, test orders routed through Monterrey instead of Shanghai. By 2022, the quiet experiment started to snowball. American brands discovered their orders from Mexico were arriving on time, even when Asian ports were clogged. Logistics managers noticed something else. Once the trucks hit Laredo or Brownsville, customs clearance took hours, not weeks. That speed turned into leverage. A product assembled in Mexico could hit U.S. store shelves faster than anything made in China. The miracle wasn't technology, it was geography rediscovered. Northern Mexico became the testing ground for this new manufacturing logic. Cities like Tijuana, Reynosa, Chihuahua, and Monterrey exploded with activity. Empty industrial parks turned into humming compounds of metal stamping, wiring harnesses, and advanced electronics assembly. What had once been low-cost maquiladoras evolved into complex operations with robotics, sensors, and lean management systems copied straight from Detroit. Investors followed fast. Foreign direct investment hit a record $21.4 billion in the first quarter of 2025, according to Mexico's Ministry of Economy. Even more revealing, 80% of that money wasn't new. It was reinvestment, companies doubling down on existing Mexican operations. That detail tells the real story. The pioneers had tried nearshoring and discovered it worked too well to stop. DRZ analysts called it the quiet boom. There was no single catalyst, no declaration of intent. It was the accumulation of 1,000 corporate survival instincts. When reporters finally asked why everything from furniture to semiconductors was suddenly coming from across the border, executives gave vague answers about efficiency. But behind those euphemisms lay fear. Fear of another pandemic-scale shutdown, fear of geopolitical escalation, fear of watching their trillion-dollar supply chains drown at sea. A logistics director from a major retail brand later admitted off-record, "We didn't move to Mexico because it was cheaper. We moved because it was reachable." That sentence became the unofficial motto of nearshoring. The point wasn't cost savings, though those came naturally. It was about control. Every factory mile closer meant less exposure, fewer things that could go wrong. That logic spread faster than anyone could map it. Construction firms couldn't pour concrete fast enough for the new industrial zones cropping up near the border. Industrial real estate investment trusts like Vesta expanded land banks along major trade arteries, anticipating years of tenant demand. Trucking companies upgraded fleets, regional airports renovated cargo terminals. The entire northern corridor of Mexico transformed into an extension of the U.S. industrial belt, except it was technically foreign soil. Meanwhile, China's manufacturing slowdown made the transition look prophetic. While US commentators debated decoupling, production lines were already relocating. Asian suppliers set up subsidiaries in Mexico rather than risk tariffs. Ironically, much of the new North American manufacturing still relied on Chinese capital and know-how. It just wore a Mexican label and passed through a duty-free checkpoint. That's why this transformation flew under Washington's radar. The trade numbers looked patriotic, the supply chains less so. For Mexican communities, the shift felt like an unexpected second industrial revolution. Towns once defined by migration to the US were now receiving workers instead of losing them. Pay wasn't high by American standards, but it was stable, and factories offered benefits unheard of a decade earlier. Technicians earned enough to afford homes near the plants. Restaurants popped up to serve the new shift schedules. In cities like Monterrey, property prices surged as multinational workforces arrived with long-term contracts. By late 2024, logistics companies called Mexico the new China just 2 days away. That phrase spread through industry conferences like a prophecy fulfilled. American CEOs started visiting the border regions again, some for the first time since NAFTA's early days. They discovered advanced automation lines, not sweatshops. Factories with 3D printing labs, bilingual engineers, and digital inventory systems linked straight to their US headquarters. Nearshoring wasn't about retreating into regionalism. It was modernization disguised as hedging. And yet the boom stayed strangely quiet in the public imagination. There were no ticker-tape parades or national speeches in Mexico City, no inflammatory rhetoric in Washington. The story hid behind routine trade statistics camouflaged by familiarity. Americans heard "Made in Mexico" and thought back to 199's outsourcing. Few realized this time Mexico wasn't just taking assembly jobs, it was absorbing strategy. Each factory built south of Texas became a pressure valve for an overextended superpower. Every conveyor belt humming in Saltillo or Querétaro reduced the shock that a disrupted Pacific route could deliver. Piece by piece, America redistributed its industrial nervous system. And once those connections formed, undoing them became impossible without shutting parts of the US economy down. That's why historians might someday call this the most important unannounced shift of the decade. While politicians obsessed over symbolic tariffs on China, the true reordering of North American power happened by osmosis. Mexico didn't lobby for it. The US engineered it through necessity. The pandemic didn't just crack global trade, it handed Mexico a blueprint for partnership that looked temporary but proved permanent. By the early months of 2025, the pattern was too broad to ignore. Mexico's manufacturing GDP ticked up again despite sluggish national growth. Analysts noted consistent export gains even as international demand faltered elsewhere. When asked why, economists answered with a shrug: nearshoring. It became both explanation and excuse, shorthand for an evolution hiding in plain sight. Looking back now, that's where the revolution truly began, not with patriotic slogans or government plans, but in spreadsheets, shipping schedules, and late-night phone calls between procurement managers desperate to keep the lights on. The crisis created the opportunity, and Mexico took it. Quietly, efficiently, permanently. Why American industry turned south? At first glance, it looked like simple arithmetic. American workers earned around $30 an hour. Mexican workers made less than $5. Shipping a container from Asia took weeks, trucking it from Monterrey took days. On a spreadsheet, the decision seemed almost insultingly obvious: move production closer, save time and money, and cut the risks that wrecked balance sheets during the pandemic. But underneath that neat math was something deeper, a psychological shift in how corporate America defines security. For decades, efficiency meant stretching supply chains across oceans. Managers chased the lowest wage anywhere on the planet. But by 2021, that logic felt toxic. Cheapest no longer meant smart. Executives wanted resilience, not miracles by sea freight. They needed factories that stayed online even when global shipping burned down. Mexico, almost by accident, became the answer. It offered cheap labor without transoceanic distance, stable institutions without the political opacity of China, and thanks to the USMCA, tariff-free access to the United States for everything produced under the right rules of origin. Those rules mattered more than anyone admitted. The updated trade agreement guaranteed that if North American content made up 75% of a product's value, it crossed borders duty-free. That clause turned Mexico into a loophole large enough to drive an entire industrial renaissance through. A car built in Coahuila could qualify as North American, even if many subcomponents had traveled halfway around the world before assembly. For U.S. corporations, that meant compliance without compromise. They could keep global sourcing flexibility while appearing patriotic. Then came the comparative shock. American manufacturing wages averaged more than 6 times higher than Mexico's. Even after recent minimum wage hikes, a skilled technician in Nuevo León earned about $4.90 an hour. The math told a ruthless story. A single shift in Mexico cost less than one worker in Michigan. Add to that electricity rates almost 30% lower and labor regulations that allowed flexible scheduling, and suddenly the numbers rewrote themselves. The same firms that once swore domestic production was strategic quietly penciled new facilities south of the border. Shipping sealed the deal. A factory in Tijuana could deliver finished goods to Texas retailers in 48 hours. From Shenzhen to Long Beach, that journey took at least 25 days, not counting customs delays. When every week of transit equaled another week of uncertainty, those lost days became intolerable. Supply chain strategists started talking about the speed dividend, the hidden profit of proximity. Products reached customers faster, inventories shrank, and executives slept better. The cost difference alone was enough to make global distance feel like a liability instead of an advantage. But the shift wasn't purely logistical, it was geopolitical. After years of sparring with China, Washington reframed trade as national security. The phrase security shoring entered policy briefings, a hybrid idea that mixed economics with defense. Mexico wasn't only convenient, it was safe territory under the US umbrella. Within that zone, investments wouldn't be trapped by sanctions or embargoes. For corporations exposed to Asian instability, North America suddenly looked like a fortress. By mid-decade, investors noticed something striking. Mexican equities had nearly doubled in US dollar terms since 2021, yet valuations hadn't expanded. Earnings, not speculation, drove the surge. That meant industrial profits were real, grounded in output rather than hype. Analysts called it resilient growth with no re-rating, a polite way of saying the world hadn't caught on yet. Beneath surface volatility, tariff announcements, border politics, campaign speeches, the fundamentals stayed rock solid. Mexico's rise didn't need optimism. It ran on inevitability. Executives framed it as partnership. They said moving south would strengthen North America as a whole, and on paper that sounded true. But every new assembly line below the Rio Grande transferred a slice of leverage away from the United States. Mexico controlled more of the inputs, the logistics, and the pace of production. A strike near Monterrey could ripple through Detroit within days. The dependency was symmetrical in theory, asymmetrical in reality. America needed the flow of goods north more than Mexico needed a guarantee of demand. They already had it. Consider autos the backbone of continental trade. Vehicles assembled in Mexico qualified for U.S. sale under USMCA provisions as long as enough of their content was regional. That encouraged U.S. carmakers to expand south rather than rebuild dormant plants at home. By 2025, Mexico had become the fifth largest vehicle producer in the world. Assembly lines in Puebla and Guanajuato churned out models wearing American badges but stamped with Mexican VIN numbers. Labor unions in the Midwest grumbled that reshoring had been redefined out of existence. In electronics, the pattern repeated. Over $100 billion in annual exports flowed north, flat-screen televisions, computers, and circuit boards, most of them made within a day's drive of the U.S. border. Companies like Samsung, Foxconn, and Jabil invested billions to modernize facilities in Guadalajara and Ciudad Juarez. The workforce followed. 125,000 engineering graduates a year feeding an industrial ecosystem, increasingly indistinguishable from the tech clusters once dominated by Asia. What truly sealed Mexico's role wasn't lower cost, it was predictability. Even with rising wages, they remained well below U.S. levels, but the reliability of truck routes, power grids, and bilingual management created what supply chain planners called functional certainty. In a world where unpredictability had become permanent, certainty was priceless. No major storm, border checkpoint, or tariff decree could freeze operations for long. That stability turned Mexico from a substitute into a cornerstone. Meanwhile, Washington's language betrayed its unease. Officials praised North American competitiveness, but every supportive statement came packaged with anxiety about losing control. Behind closed doors, policymakers admitted they couldn't pressure Mexico too hard without risking self-inflicted pain. 80% of U.S. Mexico trade already flowed within the USMCA framework, beyond the easy reach of unilateral tariffs. The very deal designed to bind neighbors together now constrained American leverage. Inside boardrooms, none of this sounded alarming. It sounded like progress. CFOs presented supply chain maps showing shorter routes and lower risk. Shareholders saw margin expansion. But if you zoomed out, the map told a subtler story. Each arrow pointing south represented not just efficiency gained, but responsibility shifted. The more seamless the integration, the harder it became to tell where one nation's production ended and the other's began. By late 2025, the numbers coalesced into something like momentum physics. The transition couldn't be reversed without enormous cost. Pulling factories back north would trigger shortages, layoffs, and political backlash. Companies were too entangled now, contracts written, warehouses leased, cross-border suppliers locked into just-in-time delivery cycles. The system relied on Mexico not as an optional partner but as a structural element. Remove it and the machine stops. Viewed coldly, Mexico had become America's spare industrial capacity, except it ran full-time and kept the lights on. The comforting phrase was regional integration. The accurate one was quiet dependence. And somewhere between those definitions lay the reason American industry turned south. It wasn't greed or betrayal or ideology. It was gravity, the pull of geography, economics, and necessity dragging production to the only place that could shoulder the weight. For the United States, that gravity carried a cost. The more they leaned on Mexico for resilience, the more fragile their autonomy became. Every truck crossing the border whispered the same paradox. Bringing supply chains closer also meant surrendering control of them. Step by step, contract by contract, America built a safety net that doubled as a leash. And as the shipments increased, that leash tightened, not abruptly, but continuously, the way quiet transformations always do. Factories of the future, Mexico's new industrial map. Factories of the future, Mexico's new industrial map. Walk through northern Mexico today and you feel it before you see it. An industrial pulse that started at the border and spread inland like electricity along a circuit. Monterrey's skyline glitters with new glass towers crowned by tech logos. Tijuana's hillsides hum with the glow of assembly plants running through the night. Ciudad Juarez, once written off as a border outpost, now ships millions of electronic devices across the Rio Grande every month. Thousands of containers roll through crowded checkpoints daily, carrying the evidence of an economic metamorphosis no one quite declared, but everyone now depends on. Each region of Mexico found its role in this new order. Monterrey became the powerhouse, a city long known for steel and beer quietly reinvented into a hub for advanced manufacturing. Dozens of multinational firms, Siemens, Jabil, and TE Connectivity among them, set up sprawling campuses there. Lines of robotic arms twist and pivot in near silence, monitored by young engineers analyzing data in spotless control rooms. The city's university graduates feed directly into these plants, bridging software and hardware in a way that blurs where production ends and design begins. Regional planners call Monterrey the anchor of the new industrial triangle, linking energy, logistics, and export power in one continuous network. Farther west, Guadalajara wears a different badge. The locals call it Mexico's Silicon Valley, and it's earned that nickname. Decades of electronics experience have evolved into something near future grade. Inside Flextronics' vast campus, circuit boards for cars, computers, and medical equipment flow down automated lines shielded by glass walls. Siemens runs a center there testing renewable energy components for both American and European markets. The city exports brains as much as products. Thousands of engineers coding firmware, designing boards, fine-tuning the machines that make everything else run. By 2025, Mexico had become the world's third largest exporter of computers, with Guadalajara at the heart of it. To the north, the twin cities of Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez anchor the border's manufacturing highway. Their industrial parks stretch for miles, cavernous buildings humming with the energy of global brands. Foxconn assembles devices here just as it does in Asia, but at a fraction of the shipping time. Jabil builds automotive electronics that end up in US and Canadian vehicles. Nearly 86% of all Mexican electronics exports head straight to the United States. Flat-screen televisions, communication hardware, industrial sensors, all totaling more than $100 billion annually. That scale pushed Mexico past nearly every regional rival, second only to China in electronics supply to the US, and the gap keeps narrowing. Behind these headline industries lies a web of logistics connecting everything like veins in a living system. Highways from Chihuahua link to rail lines cutting through Tamaulipas, then to the Gulf ports feeding Texas. In the span of 2 days, a component fabricated inland can sit in a U.S. distribution center. That temporal compression, measured not in miles but in hours, turns geography into strategic advantage. Supply chain analysts estimate that for every $100 million project, proximity to U.S. markets saves between $5 and $7 million a year in logistics and inventory costs. Those aren't marginal savings, they're structural ones. Technology amplified that gain. More than a third of Mexico's electronics manufacturing service providers now run Industry 4. Systems, integrating automation, AI-driven quality control, and network sensors. Workers wear smart devices tracking productivity and safety in real time. Digital twins simulate production runs before physical machines even move. That leap in sophistication erased the last stereotype of the low-cost assembler. Today's maquiladora zones look more like miniature space programs than sweatshops. It's not just a change in machinery but in identity, Mexico moving from cheap labor to strategic capability. None of this happened in a vacuum. Policy followed where momentum led. The Sheinbaum administration launched Plan Mexico, a blueprint of 15 tax-incentivized industrial corridors designed to lock in the nearshoring boom. Stretching from the northeast border to the central highlands, each corridor aligns with a priority sector: automotive in Coahuila, aerospace in Querétaro, logistics in Veracruz, electronics in Jalisco. The plan pairs tax incentives with infrastructure promises: new energy lines, renewable power commitments, and expanded highways. By pledging to double clean energy capacity by 203, from 80 to 156 terawatt-hours, the government signaled that the future factories of North America would run on Mexican electrons as well as Mexican labor. Investors responded instantly. The electronics sector alone pulled in roughly $12 billion in foreign direct investment during 2025, much of it from reinvested profits. Real estate developers like Vesta expanded faster than contractors could pour foundations, using their Route 203 plan to pre-lease industrial parks in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City long before construction finished. Analysts joke that it's the only time in recent memory when supply struggled to keep up with supply chains themselves. But the numbers only hint at how deeply this restructuring reaches into daily life. Walk through a facility in Reynosa and you'll notice the accents. Operators switching seamlessly between Spanish and English, tablet screens coded from software teams in Guadalajara, instruction videos subtitled for visiting engineers from Michigan. The integration is cultural as much as economic. For younger Mexican engineers, the old aspiration to go north has flipped. They stay home, building products that cross the border without them. Towns once dependent on remittances now run on paychecks earned in high-tech factories. The automotive sector exemplifies the transformation scale. By 2025, Mexico ranked as the fifth largest vehicle producer on Earth, rivaling Japan and Germany for export diversity. Its plants assemble internal combustion engines, electric vehicles, and hybrid systems for virtually every global brand. Firms like General Motors, Stellantis, and Toyota expanded Mexican capacity to meet strict U.S. emission targets while keeping costs manageable. The ripple effects stretch through secondary suppliers: metal stamping, battery pack assembly, electronic control modules, all thriving in border clusters that function as an unspoken continuation of the U.S. Midwest industrial belt. And yet there's an undercurrent of tension inside the success story. Growth that fast rewires dependencies. Every new automation line in Chihuahuan deserts tightens American reliance on Mexican infrastructure, power grids, trucking routes, even water supply. Logistics planners whisper about the single-point exposure, a polite phrase for too much concentration risk. If a single state suffers a strike, blackout, or flood, production halts across multiple U.S. industries within days. North America's industrial resilience increasingly begins, and therefore can break south of the border. That interdependence gives Mexico quiet leverage it's never wielded before. Policymakers in Washington praise regional integration while quietly modeling worst-case scenarios of border shutdowns. Companies structure insurance clauses around it. Meanwhile, Mexican officials project confidence, framing their nation not as a subcontractor, but as the backbone of continental productivity. Behind speeches about friendship lies a subtle power equation. The U.S. may set the consumer demand, but Mexico now holds the production throttle. And it's not stopping at assembly. Research and development centers are multiplying near the new plants, closing the loop between innovation and output. Guadalajara's campuses are designing chips, not just soldering them. Monterrey's universities host joint programs with American partners on AI-driven manufacturing. Even smaller cities, San Luis Potosi, Chihuahua, Mexico City, are emerging as specialized clusters for electric vehicle components and medical technology. The map of Mexican industry no longer hugs the border. It sprawls deep into the interior, forming a lattice of technical expertise that will be hard for any competitor or customer to unwind. So when analysts speak of factories of the future, they're not describing prototypes still on drawing boards. They're talking about the network already humming across Mexico right now, automated, green-powered, and algorithmically managed. It stands as both proof and warning, the fulfillment of America's regional dream and the start of its dependence. Because every new machine powered up in Monterrey sends a quiet signal northward. The center of gravity in North American manufacturing has migrated. Not through conquest or decree, but through competence, reliability, and proximity. And as the hum deepens across Mexico's industrial heartland, the paradox sharpens. The very systems designed to make America more secure against global shocks have planted the heart of its resilience beyond its borders. The factories of the future are already built, and they're running on Mexican time.